Don't open that door yet. I need you to understand something first. When I walked into that hospital room and saw my wife lying there with tubes in her arm and a machine breathing for her, I told myself it was her age. I told myself it was her age. I told myself it was the stress of the past year. I told myself a lot of things because the truth, the actual truth, was something I wasn't ready to hold in my hands. I've been married to my wife for 41 years. 41 years of Sunday mornings and burned toast and arguments about the thermostat and slow dances in the kitchen when we thought nobody was looking. She taught third grade for 32 of those years. She still keeps a ceramic apple on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. She cries at dog food commercials. She is the softest, most decent person I have ever known, and somebody in my own family had been slowly, deliberately trying to kill her. I did not know that yet. Not on the morning of February 3rd, when I followed the ambulance to Mercy General in my bathrobe and house slippers because I hadn't had time to change. Not when the ER doctor told me her potassium levels were dangerously low and her nervous system was presenting in a way we don't fully understand yet. Not even when they moved her to the ICU and a different doctor used the phrase systemic deterioration and looked at me with that particular kind of pity that doctors save for people whose situations are already decided. I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. My son drove up from Raleigh. My daughter called from Phoenix every 45 minutes. And I sat there in my house slippers on a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, trying to remember if my wife had eaten anything unusual, if she'd mentioned feeling off, if I had missed something I should have caught. I had missed something I should have caught. Just not the kind of thing any husband would think to look for. My wife started getting sick in September. It started small, fatigue which her doctor chalked up to the tail end of summer heat. Then her hands started trembling, barely noticeable at first, just a slight shake when she poured her morning coffee. Then the hair loss, then the numbness in her feet that made her grip the stair railing every single morning coming down to breakfast. By November, she had lost 11 pounds without trying. By December, she couldn't finish a sentence without stopping to find the word she was looking for. Her doctor ran tests: thyroid, B12, iron, vitamin D. Everything came back in a range that looked normal enough to not alarm anyone. He told us stress was a powerful thing. He told us the body sometimes takes longer to recover from things as we age. He adjusted her blood pressure medication and told us to schedule a follow-up in 8 weeks. We scheduled the follow-up. We never made it. The morning I called 911, she couldn't lift her head off the pillow. She was conscious, but barely. She looked at me and I could see her trying to say something and not being able to get there. I held her hand the whole ride to the hospital. It was the coldest morning we'd had all winter, and the heater in the ambulance was running full blast, and I was still shivering. What I did not know, what I had no earthly reason to suspect, was that my daughter-in-law had been coming by the house almost every week since October. She would bring things, groceries sometimes, a casserole once, herbal tea that she said was good for energy. She would sit with my wife at the kitchen table while I was out at my Wednesday morning men's group at church, and they would drink tea together. And my wife always said she seemed so thoughtful, so attentive. My wife liked her. I liked her. She was part of our family. That was the part that made it so hard to see. The nurse who changed everything was named Adrian, head nurse on the 4th floor ICU, 22 years in that hospital, the kind of woman who speaks in complete sentences and looks you directly in the eye. She had been assigned to my wife's case since the transfer from the ER. She found me on the second day, late afternoon, when the floor was quieter. I was standing in the hallway outside my wife's room, looking through the window at the monitors, trying to read numbers I didn't understand. She came up beside me and said quietly, "Mr. Coleman, can I ask you to step down to the family consultation room for a moment?" I thought she was going to tell me something had changed. I thought she was going to tell me it was worse than they thought. I followed her down the hall with my stomach already falling, and she closed the door behind us. And then she didn't sit down. She stood, and she looked at me, and she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Has anyone other than yourself been preparing food or beverages for your wife at home?" I didn't understand the question at first. I said yes, of course. Our daughter-in-law comes by sometimes. She brings things. She's been very helpful." Adrian held up her hand gently and stopped me. "I've been doing this for over 2 decades," she said, "and there's a pattern in your wife's blood work that I've seen before. Not often, but I've seen it." She paused. "We're running a full toxicology panel. It won't be back until tomorrow morning. But I wanted to have this conversation with you now, before the results come in. Because if I'm right about what I'm seeing, and I hope to God I'm not, you're going to need time to process it before anyone else is in the room." I sat down. I don't remember deciding to sit down. My legs just made that decision on their own. "What are you seeing?" I asked. She told me about a particular presentation of symptoms: the hair loss, the peripheral neuropathy, the neurological confusion, the weight loss, that, taken together over several months, suggested something other than natural illness. She told me there was a substance historically used in certain kinds of rodent poison before being largely restricted that produced exactly this kind of slow cumulative damage. That was detectable only if you specifically looked for it. That was colorless, odorless, easily dissolved in liquid. She said the word, thallium. I had to ask her to say it again because my ears had stopped working properly. The toxicology results came back at 6:47 the following morning. I know the exact time because I had not slept, and I was sitting in the chair by my wife's bed watching her breathe, and Adrian came in personally to tell me. She didn't send a resident, she didn't leave a note, she came in herself. The thallium was there, had been accumulating for months. The levels indicated repeated small exposures over an extended period of time. Not a single event, not an accident, not contamination from some external source. Someone had been doing this on purpose. I walked to the window. I stood there looking out at the parking lot. Gray winter morning, a few cars, a woman in scrubs walking toward the entrance with a coffee. And I felt something happen inside me that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't anger yet. Anger came later. It was more like the world had briefly gone silent, and I was standing in the middle of that silence completely alone, understanding that everything I thought I knew about my life had just been rearranged. Adrian had already called the hospital's patient safety team. They were required by law to notify authorities when evidence of intentional poisoning was identified. A detective was coming. She told me his name. She told me he was good. She put her hand on my arm for just a moment, and then she left me alone to make the phone calls I had to make. I stood there for another minute. Then I called my son. Detective Bryce Langford arrived at 11 that morning. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s, lean, quiet in the way that certain kinds of careful people are quiet. He had a legal pad and a pen, and he used both constantly. He did not waste words. He sat across from me in the consultation room, and he asked me to walk him through the past several months. Everything I could remember. Who came to the house, how often, what they brought, what my wife ate and drank, any changes I had noticed. He asked about finances. He asked about life insurance. He asked, gently but directly, about my will. I told him everything. And then, because I needed to say it out loud, I told him what I was thinking. I told him about my daughter-in-law's visits, the tea, the groceries, the particular consistency of her presence since October, right when the symptoms had begun. He wrote everything down. He didn't confirm or deny anything. He said, "I appreciate you telling me that. We're going to be thorough." Then he asked if he could have access to my kitchen. My son drove me home that afternoon to meet the evidence collection team. I walked through the front door of the house I have lived in for 26 years and stood in my own kitchen, while 2 technicians in gloves went through my cabinets, my refrigerator, the drawer where we keep herbal teas and vitamins. They took samples of everything. They bagged and tagged 3 boxes of loose-leaf tea that I had never purchased, that had been in the cabinet for months, that my wife drank every single week. I didn't touch anything. I stood in the doorway and watched and kept my hands in my pockets. The investigation lasted 11 days. During those 11 days, my wife began to improve. Once the source of exposure was removed and treatment began, chelation therapy, careful monitoring, close observation, Her body started doing what bodies do when the thing hurting them is finally taken away. The tremors slowed. Her words came back. By day 6, she was sitting up and asking about her plants. By day 9, she told me I needed a haircut. I nearly cried in that hospital room. During those same 11 days, Detective Langford and his team were doing work I wasn't privy to. I know they spoke to my son. I know they reviewed financial records. I know they interviewed people I didn't know about, asked questions I wasn't present for. I received one call on day 8 asking me to confirm a few dates. I confirmed them. Langford thanked me and hung up. On the morning of day 11, I was at the hospital with my wife when my son called me. He could barely speak. "Dad," he said, "they arrested her. This morning, at our house." I went to the window again. Same habit, I suppose. Something about looking out at something ordinary when everything else is extraordinary. "Are you all right?" I asked him. He was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Dad, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. I didn't know. I believed him. I still believe him. I still believe him. I still am he's not." A complicated man. He is honest in the way that his mother is, honest, open-faced, and direct, incapable of sustained deception. Whatever was going on inside that marriage, he had been living beside it without seeing it, the same way I had been living beside it and not seeing it. Some things are designed to be invisible. That's the whole point. What the investigation eventually revealed, pieced together from financial records, text messages, and testimony that I only learned of much later, was this. My daughter-in-law had taken out a life insurance policy on my wife 14 months earlier. My wife had signed something she thought was a medical directive update. She hadn't read the fine print. Nobody had told her to. The policy was substantial, the kind of substantial that changes a person's circumstances entirely. My daughter-in-law had financial problems I was not aware of. Debt from before the marriage. Debt accumulated quietly during it. A pattern of spending and covering and managing appearances that had been invisible to everyone around her, including my son. She had been drowning, slowly, and she had decided, at some point I cannot locate and do not understand, that my wife was the answer to that problem. She had done research. She had been methodical. She had sourced the thallium through channels the detective described to me as not difficult for someone motivated to find. She had administered it in small amounts, over months, in loose-leaf herbal tea that she brought from a specific store and replaced regularly so that the supply never ran out. She had sat at my kitchen table with my wife. She had refilled her cup. She had asked how she was feeling. And she had done this over and over again for months, while my wife thanked her for being so thoughtful. When the detective told me all of this, I asked him one question. "How close?" I said. "How close did she come?" He looked at me carefully. "The levels we found were approaching the range that causes irreversible neurological damage," he said. "Another few months, possibly less, and we'd be having a very different conversation." I nodded. I thanked him. I went back to my wife's hospital room and I sat down in the chair beside her bed and I held her hand and she asked me what was wrong because she could always read my face, 41 years of practice, and I told her nothing was wrong. I told her everything was going to be fine. I told her I was just glad to be there. I wasn't lying exactly. Everything was going to be fine, eventually. My daughter-in-law was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and elder abuse. She pleaded not guilty. There was a trial. The evidence was thorough. The financial records, the insurance policy, the chemical analysis of the tea, the toxicology, the timeline of her visits cross-referenced with the progression of my wife's symptoms. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. She was convicted on all counts. My son sat behind a prosecutor's table. He did not look at his wife once during the verdict. When it was over, he walked out of the courtroom, and he came to find me in the hallway, and he stood in front of me like a man who doesn't know what posture to hold in a moment like this, and I put my arms around him. He's 61 years old. He cried like he was 12. I held him for as long as he needed. My wife has been home for 4 months now. The ceramic apple is back on the windowsill. She cried at a paper towel commercial last week. She has gained back 7 of the 11 pounds. She still holds the stair railing in the morning, but the doctors say the remaining nerve issues will continue to improve with time. We don't talk about it much. That might surprise you, but we are old enough to know that some things don't need to be talked about in order to be understood. She knows what happened. She knows what was done to her and why and by whom. She knows how close it came. She has processed that in her own way, in her own time, the way she processes everything, quietly, at her own pace, with a dignity I have spent 41 years admiring. What she said to me once, about a week after she came home, was this: I kept telling myself I was just getting old, that the way I felt was just what getting old feels like. She said it without anger, just a kind of tired clarity. I'm sorry, I told her. I should have pushed harder. I should have. She squeezed my hand. You didn't know, she said. How could you know? She was right. How could I know? How does any of us know what's happening right in front of us when the person doing it has made their whole plan depend on us not knowing? I've thought about this every day since February 3rd. I've thought about the signs I missed and the ones I couldn't have caught and the difference between those two categories. I've thought about my daughter-in-law sitting in my kitchen looking my wife in the eye, and I cannot hold that thought for very long before I have to put it down. I've thought about how trust works in families, how it's built slowly and assumed automatically, and almost never examined until there's a reason to examine it, at which point the damage is already done. I've thought about Adrian, the head nurse on the 4th floor who had seen this before, just enough times to know what she was looking at, who could have said nothing, who maybe had every institutional reason to wait for the results before speaking, but who came and found me in that hallway and took me to a quiet room and told me the truth before she had to. I sent her flowers when my wife came home. She sent a note back that said, "This is exactly why I do this work." I think about that note a lot. Here is what I know. At 67 years old, after everything, the people who love you are not always the ones who say they do. Love is not a declaration. It is a pattern of behavior sustained over time when nobody is watching and there is nothing to gain. That's the only version of love that means anything. Everything else is performance. My wife knew that. She has always known it. She just had the profound misfortune of extending that trust to someone who was performing. She is home now. She is fine. The apple is on the windowsill. And if you are watching this tonight, wondering whether your gut is telling you something, whether something in your home or your family doesn't quite add up, listen to it. Not because the worst is always true, but because you deserve to know what's true. And so does the person you love. Don't wait until someone has to pull you into a quiet room to tell you what's already been happening in your own house. I waited. I got lucky. Not everyone does.